Have you been to the lake recently and felt like every good spot in the lake has a boat on it? Well, you're definitely not alone. Fishing pressure has increased dramatically over the past 5 years, and it's changing bass behavior, specifically on where these bass are setting up. In this video, I'm going to share some new data that will open your eyes to this change in bass behavior and help you figure out where you should be looking if you want to find some fish all to yourself on your local lake. Let's get into it. I recently watched a video from Ken Smith, who sat down with a biologist from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. This biologist had been running a study on bass on Lake Fork and Toledo Bend Lake in Texas. The study showed that bass were spending 41% of their time throughout a given year on offshore flats. Offshore flats are basically gradual, sloping areas with no sudden depth changes or no defining features in a contour line map. Not that many bass were setting up on channel swings, points, ditches, or other types of structure that are commonly thought of to hold bass year-round. Instead, they were on these broad open flats. We actually saw this play out during the BPT Major League Fishing event on Lake Fork, where a lot of the guys were catching fish on just random flats that had timber on them on Lake Fork, and they were targeting those fish with jerkbaits. Now, this isn't a new bass behavior. I've been catching fish on these nondescript offshore flats for over 15 years now, and a lot of tournaments have been won that way over the years as well. However, I feel like more fish are starting to transition to these less obvious gradual flats because the more obvious areas are getting a lot more pressure. To back this theory up with more data, I pulled some results from the Bassmaster Elite Series between 2010 to 2020. This data comes from the Deep Dive app that I'm working on. If we aggregate all of the different types of structures that were used to get a top 3 finish in these Bassmaster League Series events over a 10-year period, you'll see that 38% of the top 3 finishes came from flats. This is a very interesting number because from the Texas Parks and Wildlife study, it showed that 41% of bass were setting up on flats. That's only a 4% difference from these tournament results. Now, I'm not saying there's a perfect correlation between tournament results and the tracking study, but it is interesting that the number is so close. And more importantly, what you'll find is that the different types of structure that are more commonly associated with bass fishing, like points, ledges, or channel swings, are not nearly as effective in these tournaments as one might think. To illustrate this idea a little bit better, let me pull up a contour line map. What I'm going to do is highlight all of the obvious structural elements that pop off the screen based on what a bass fishing textbook would say about where bass should live. First up, we have our creek channel here. This isn't going to be on every lake type, but right here I'm looking at a lowland reservoir, so this has a creek channel. This then creates 2 channel swing banks. The channel swing banks are places where you have deeper water swinging up against a shallower bank. This creates sharp contour lines, and these channel swing banks are pretty obvious on a contour line map and receive a lot of pressure from fishermen. Next up, we have some offshore points. These points are shallower pieces of water that stick out into the middle of the lake. Again, these points are pretty obvious in a contour line map and receive a ton of fishing pressure. Next, we have a less obvious point called a rounded point. It's still a pretty good area to find fish, though it's not as obvious as those first points we marked up. Still, these spots do get a lot of fishing pressure nowadays, just with the increase in information out there. Finally, we have some offshore ditches. Offshore ditches are definitely less obvious than the other pieces of structure I pointed out earlier, but they still receive fishing pressure again thanks to the information that's now out there for anglers. There are a few other types of structure I could mark up, but hopefully that gets the point across that there are a lot of obvious structural elements in this image. However, these bass are not setting up on any of these spots as much as they are on the flats that were mentioned in that tracking study or that I showed in that graph earlier. Here is what I would consider the flats in this area, and I'm going to highlight it here in red. Flats are basically the nondescript gradual sloping areas that don't have any sharp drop-offs, they don't have an obvious feature off the bank like a point, or they don't have a creek channel swinging right by it. Instead, it's just a nothing-looking area. And this is where a lot of these bass are setting up. And I think the reason for this is because all of the other areas on this map that I've highlighted are receiving a ton of fishing pressure, especially over the last 5 years. As more anglers are getting out in the lake and also more anglers have more information about where to fish, the obvious structure spots are getting pounded by more fishermen. This is then pushing fish away from these obvious areas to these flats that are receiving less fishing pressure, if not no fishing pressure. And I actually pulled up this specific image for a reason. This is a section of a creek on Jordan Lake over in North Carolina. And I was there about 2 years ago doing on-the-water fishing lessons. I don't do those anymore, unfortunately, but I used to back then. And I was actually doing this lesson on a Saturday during a major championship for this lake. There were 150 boats in a tournament fishing on this lake, plus all of the regular locals that are out there on the Saturday, putting the total number of boats on this relatively small lake to over 200. Now, I didn't want to get in the way of the other anglers that were fishing in this tournament, so I tried to stay off of these obvious spots that I marked here, the points, the ditches, stuff like that, and I couldn't fish them anyways because every single one was covered up with a boat. Instead, I started graphing in between all of those obvious areas to show the people I was with what the different types of cover and structure look like on a fish finder. What was interesting is that after about 30 minutes of graphing, we identified an isolated log that was on one of these flat, nondescript areas. On that log, there were a couple of really nice dots, and I wish I had the side imaging recording. I don't anymore, but it looked awesome on the fish finder, though there wasn't any depth change or anything different about that spot. It was just a log out there. So we ended up making a few casts down there, and on the second cast across the spots, the guy I was with caught an 8-pounder off that log. Again, it was on a really boring looking flat out in the middle of the lake. Nothing interesting around there, and there were no other anglers even close to us just because it didn't look like a great spot, but we caught a really big fish. We actually then were able to replicate this 2 or 3 more times throughout the day and had over 20 pounds of fish while dodging all these other tournament anglers, and we would have done really well in that tournament if we had actually been fishing. This just goes to show that fishing these flats can be extremely productive. However, it's also extremely difficult and time-consuming. The reason that a lot of anglers don't fish these flats is because there's no way to know where on that flat is going to be a more productive area or a less productive area. Normally around a point or a ledge or a channel swing, you can identify the key areas that might hold fish on a contour line map. However, the only way to identify the sweet spots on an offshore flat is to graph with your fish finder. This means you can either sit down on the big engine and look at your graph in your console while using side imaging to scan that flat for rocks, stumps, or laydowns, or nowadays you can just drop your trolling motor with a forward-facing sonar attached to it and just start scoping around on these flats. This is a lot more effective on places like Lake Fork where you have a lot of standing timber and you can't really maneuver your big engine through those trees as effectively. However, if you don't have standing timber and you just have a big flat that may have some grass or some rocks, it's probably more efficient to graph with your big engine using side imaging because you can go a little bit faster and still get a clear image. On the big engine, I can normally graph between 3 to 5 miles an hour and still get a good image, where when I'm on my trolling motor with live scope, I may only be able to go 1 to 2 miles an hour and effectively scope side to side. You kind of have to scan and sweep with that trolling motor so you can't keep it going in the same direction constantly. But both can be very effective ways at finding fish on these offshore flats, if not very time consuming. In general, it might take 1 hour to 2 hours of graphing either with side imaging or live scope to find a group of fish or a nice isolated piece of cover or anything else that's going to be holding fish on these flats. This takes dedication and time. You're not going to be able to go out there and just pull up on a big nondescript flat and find fish in 5 minutes unless you get pretty lucky. You need to put the time in with your electronics to locate those fish. If you do, though, you're going to have a spot most likely all to yourself, and you're not going to have a lot of fishing pressure in that area. This is a great strategy for tournament anglers who are fishing on really pressured bodies of water that have a lot of tournaments going out, or just lakes that get a lot of fishing pressure in general. The key is to dedicate some time to driving with your electronics or going around with your live scope to find those fish, and being okay going 2 to 3 hours sometimes without finding anything interesting. Now, there is an easy way to identify isolated pieces of cover and sweet spots on these offshore flats, and that's using Google Earth. If you're lucky and your lake has historical images of the lake when it's drawn down, you can often find these flats that are in 4 to 8 feet of water when they're completely dry. There's no water there, and you can find isolated rocks, laydowns, brush, stuff like that on these flats. Now, not every single lake is going to have these historical images, but if you do want to check out this method, I'll link a video down below in the description that shows you how to actually find these historical images, how to mark waypoints on those isolated objects in these flats, and then transfer those waypoints straight to your fish finder so you can go use them on the lake. Again, that video will be linked down in the description. And if you're enjoying the information in this video so far, you can think of it as kind of a teaser for an upcoming seminar I have on my website, fishthemoment.com. Just go to my virtual seminars tab and you'll find an advanced offshore strategy seminar. It's a 3-hour seminar that's focused on how to find less pressured fish offshore, how to catch fish on community holes using unique boat positionings, retrieves, and baits that other anglers haven't been using typically, and also how to strategize for a fishing tournament to outmaneuver other anglers on offshore areas. I spend 5 to 8 hours every single week graphing offshore and fishing offshore, and I have a lot of great tips and tricks I can share with you on how to outmaneuver your competition on these offshore areas. The video you're watching right now is just a little sneak peek at the kind of information you'll get. So again, if you enjoy the content of this video, make sure to check out the seminar on fishthemoment.com. Another good skill to have is the ability to identify all the obvious spots on the contour line map and then filter those out of your brain, or basically ignore those areas and only focus on the boring, ugly looking stuff. I've been doing this now for 2 to 3 years, honestly, and when I go to the lake, I just find the most boring looking spots on the entire lake that don't pop out on the contour line map at all, and I graph those instead of graphing the obvious stuff, and it gives me an advantage over other anglers. Again, I'm spending 4 to 5 hours of my fishing day a lot of times graphing to achieve good results with this method, but if you're willing to give up a third or half of your day to graphing, you can be very, very effective. This is not a fishing style for everyone. It's definitely something for more advanced anglers or maybe tournament anglers. But if you are interested in this style, check out a lot of my old Catch 15 videos that I've done in the past. Basically every single one of those videos is me fishing this exact way. I'm graphing nondescript, non-obvious areas with my fish finder, finding isolated pieces of cover, isolated schools of fish, and then catching them. Hopefully this video is helpful, guys, and this data opened your eyes to maybe a new way to think about fishing and a new way to identify key areas for bass. If you enjoyed the video, really appreciate it if you subscribe to the Fish the Moment YouTube channel so you can get more content like this, and also leave a like on the video. It helps me out the YouTube algorithm. Thanks again for checking out this video. We'll see you all next one.